Hey, history scholars, this is a lecture about the Texas Revolution. Before I launch into the lecture, I want to remind you about where the United States is with regards to some of the tensions and conflict that it is experiencing. So remember that the North and the South are fighting pretty severely at this time over the issue of slavery. And even more deeply than that, what they're struggling over is if states are going to be admitted to the Union as free or slave states. And that discussion happened over and over and over during this time. So that is the backdrop, really, to the Texas Revolution. So the first question I want to answer is, how did the Texas Revolution begin? So it began in 1819 with the signing of a treaty with Spain called the Adams-Onis Treaty. And what this treaty did was it basically drew a boundary between New Spain and the United States. So taking a look at this map, you see the red line, and below the red line is New Spain, and above the red line is the United States. And what's important to remember, you guys, is that the British, the French, and Spain all had basically some ownership at some point in time of the United States. And over time, the British beat out the French, and then we beat out the British, and now Spain still has some territory. And so that is why that area is called New Spain. So, because of this treaty, there was added interest and there was a desire to migrate into the fertile area of Texas, it bordered New Spain. If we look back at this map, you can see here that this is basically the area that they are trying to relocate to, because it was so beautiful and great for farming. And there was also that desire to fulfill manifest destiny, which really is expanding from coast to coast, and that God's desire was for us to do so. As they migrated into the Texas area, there was no strong Spanish government in that area. And so, as more and more Americans migrated, the Spanish just couldn't govern that number of people. At the same time, at about 1821, the native people of New Spain actually overthrew Spain and they won their independence. And so Mexico was born. And so that is called the Mexican Revolution. But still, the Spanish couldn't govern, and Mexico struggled to govern the Texas area as well. So Mexico was not happy with the American migration. And so they started to control that migration through what are called empresarios. They're types of contracts. And these contracts did a number of things. First of all, they granted a certain amount of land per person, so they kind of limited it. They gave Mexico some control over how many people moved in. They kind of had a voucher system going on. And Stephen Austin actually was able to settle 300 Anglo families in Texas by creating a contract with the Mexican government, and got a city named after him. Lucky guy. By 1830, there were 30,000 Anglos or Americans and 5,000 Mexicans. So that's quite a significant increase in Americans. And that caused all sorts of problems, you guys. It caused problems with culture, religion, language, and then yet again, the question of slavery arose. With 30,000 Anglos in that area, of course, some of them had and owned slaves. And so they had brought their slaves with them. Well, the Mexicans didn't like that. The Mexican government, they started to pass laws restricting migration, which Americans hate. Anytime you try to restrict American, things don't go well. Okay. And also, Mexico, they started passing laws to prohibit slavery. And so the Americans started to become very unhappy. Then at the same time, or around this time, slightly after, was 1833, the election of the new Mexican president, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. Supposedly, he was elected under false claims. He was considered a dictator by some, but he started to crack down on Texas and the American migrants. And again, they didn't like that. Texans decided to then try and declare independence from Mexico in 1835. They wanted their slaves and they wanted their land. Okay. So Santa Anna obviously hates that idea. And he thinks, I'm a new country, I'm a new dictator, politician, and I will not lose any land under my watch. And so he invades Texas and focuses his efforts in San Antonio, which leads us then to the Battle of the Alamo. So, as some of you know, or maybe some of you have visited, the Alamo is located in San Antonio, Texas. It's an old Spanish mission building, and you just need to know that in New Spain, they built Spanish mission buildings kind of like the French built forts in the Ohio Territory. Okay, so there were a lot of Spanish mission buildings in this area. And when some of the Texas rebels heard that Santa Anna was on his way to San Antonio, 189 Texas rebels took shelter in the Alamo. They kind of used it as a fortress. And some of the more famous people that took shelter in the Alamo at this time were William Travis, Davy Crockett, James Bowie. So Santa Anna surrounds the Alamo for 12 days, and on the 13th day, Santa Anna's army of 6,000 men, not much of a, I don't know, it's 6,000 versus 189. It's not going to go real well for the 189, let's just say, but they attack the Alamo, and all 189 Texas men die. All right. At the same time, we have to give the 189 rebels a little bit of credit because they did manage to kill 1,500 of Santa Anna's troops, which severely weakened his army. Okay, so after the Alamo, Santa Anna moves even further into Texas. He boldly just continues going after the Texans. And regardless, he moved forward even though supplies were limited, his troops were becoming weaker. It was harder to replace the troops that he had lost, and also make sure that they have enough ammunition and supplies. So his frustration ends up growing during this time. In enters Sam Houston, who was the commander of the Texas Army. And it might be really cool for you to pause me and take a look at this map a little bit more closely. But you can see on the map that you can see Houston's route, you can see Santa Anna's and where he splits and things like that. So, anyway, spend a little bit of time looking at that. But Sam Houston proved to be a student of history. And he obviously knew what George Washington did during the Revolution, and it worked out for George Washington. And so Sam Houston decided to do the same thing. But Sam Houston decided to just sit back and wait. He waited for Santa Anna to make mistakes. He waited for Santa Anna and his army to tire. He waited for Santa Anna and his army to weaken to the extent that then Sam Houston could do really well against him. So the mistake that Sam Houston was waiting for happened in the spring of 1836. Santa Anna divided his army, and his army was already weakened. Okay. So Santa Anna then started to head for San Jacinto to meet Houston's army. And it was not a long battle at all. Everyone in Santa Anna's army was captured or killed, and it was over within 30 minutes. So at this point in time, Texas achieved its independence. Okay, so the official date of its independence for Texas is 1836. And that happened after Santa Anna was captured, and they negotiated its independence immediately after the Battle of Jacinto. It was called the Republic of Texas, and this is the flag that they used for the Lone Star State. Here is the significance of the Texas Revolution. So once Texas gained its independence from Mexico, of course it's going to want to apply for statehood. These are Americans living in this area. And so, they created a constitution. They established the fact that they had 65,000 people, and they applied for statehood. However, they applied as a slave state. And the North fought against it. They were very concerned about the balance of power between North and the South. And so the North fought the entry of Texas as a state for 10 years. And so in that amount of time, Texas stayed an independent republic. And in essence, you guys, they were basically their own mini nation for 10 years. And so when people talk about, how tough Texas is, or, how they might secede in the 21st century, they kind of have a history of being exceptionally independent. And this 10 years of being an independent republic kind of says a lot about that. Eventually, Texas did enter as a slave state in 1845. So that is the history of the Texas Revolution, a little bit about the Alamo. Thanks for being here, you guys.